The events of 1066. Edward the Confessor was the King of England at the time, but he was ill and coming to the end of his reign. There was only one problem. He had no children because of his religious beliefs. He had chosen to become a monk and devoted most of his life to religion. He took vows of celibacy, which meant he could not have any children. This caused some problems. There was no successor to the throne, but there were some angry rulers who wanted to take the throne of England. Harold Godwinson. He claimed to have been made king by Edward the Confessor. William, Duke of Normandy. William was a distant cousin of Edward and wanted to be the next king. He claimed that both Edward and Harold Godwinson had promised him the throne. Harold Hardrada. He believed that he was the rightful heir to the English throne because he was a descendant of King Canute of England. However, in September 1066, Harold became king because he was able to convince the Witangam to choose him as king. However, later on he got invaded by Harold Hardrada, and this is what happened. It is September of 1066, and Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, sails with 300 ships to the shores of Yorkshire to fight for the English throne. When he reached the shores, he was joined by Tostig Godwinson, Harold's exiled brother, who wanted an opportunity to reclaim the earldom of Northumbria. Harold saw him as useful, because he could give him valuable information about the land they were planning to invade. They started at Scarborough, where they burned the village and took all of its goods, and then they headed south to the Humber estuary on the 18th of September. Harold first targeted the city of York, so they sailed up the River Ouse towards York. However, their scouts fed them information that there were numerous English forces that were defending York, so they landed 10 miles south of York and prepared for the upcoming encounter. The majority of the Anglo-Saxon army were Mercians and Northumbrians, led by brothers Morcar of Northumbria and Edwin of Mercia. The English spread their troops in a long line across the stream to secure their flanks. Edwin took the right flank, which was close to the River Ouse, as Morcar took the left flank, spreading to the east. The army totalled at around 5,000 men. A lot of the ground was marshland, which made it difficult for the enemy to manoeuvre. Harold Hardrada's army was advancing north towards the marshland, but were outnumbered by the English, as Harold Hardrada left a big chunk of his army to guard the ships. Both sides were waiting for the stream, which had flooded due to the tide. A while later, when the tide finally went out, the English attacked right away and tried to take advantage of their bigger army. However, Harold Hardrada was being joined by arriving units, and he would eventually outnumber the English. First off, Morcar and the Northumbrian men charged the centre of Harold Hardrada's army, and also the right flank, where Hardrada's least experienced soldiers were located at, along with Tostig's forces. Melee fighting began on the marshland along the ford, with losses of men on both sides. Edwin's portion of troops were starting to lose the battle, so they fled back with Vikings chasing after them. However, Morcar's side was in fierce battle, doing quite well still, until Vikings that had been chasing Edwin's flank had regrouped, so they too fled. Hardrada had been victorious, but he was not able to avoid casualties. Harold Hardrada lost 900 men of the 6,000 directly involved in battle, while Harold Godwinson lost 750 men of the 5,000 he had. The 25th of September was very warm, so the Vikings left their armour on the ship in order to cool down, but their ship was many miles away. The Vikings had just won the previous battle against the troops led by Edwin and Morcar, but now it was time for the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The Vikings advanced up north to get to Stamford Bridge and set up base while they were preparing for Harold Godwinson to invade. When Godwinson arrived, he arrived on the west side of the bridge. He tried to advance over the bridge, but there were Vikings guarding it. Godwinson managed to get past the Vikings and over the bridge, but at the end of the bridge they were interrupted by one
lone Viking. This Viking had a long axe and managed to cut down 40 of Godwinson's men and kept a whole entire army still just by himself. After he had cut down 40 men, he was stopped by an Anglo-Saxon who climbed below the bridge and came up behind him and stabbed him in the back with a spear. Now it was time for Hardrada and Godwinson to fight. Harold Hardrada set up a long shield wall and Godwinson set up a line parallel to it. Godwinson made the first move. He advanced forward towards the Vikings and they got to the shield wall and managed to weaken it very, very severely, and some major melee fighting took place. Although the strength of the soldiers was shown by the Viking that cut down 40 Anglo-Saxons, they were not so strong when they left their armour many miles away. This meant the shield wall was not as strong as it could have been. Harold Hardrada took an arrow to the throat and his army started to panic. Harold Godwinson formed an arc around Hardrada, which meant that he was circled in. Some reserve troops came from the south to help Harold Hardrada, but they were no use as they were killed by Godwinson's forces. It was late September 1066, and William was waiting for the winds to change so he could sail to England, and the Battle of Fulford was still underway. It took a while, but the winds finally changed, and William gathered his army and set sail across the English Channel. When they had finally arrived at Pevensey Bay in Sussex, they had been informed that Hardrada and Godwinson were still in battle. So they took their time and marched down to Hastings, where they set up a temporary camp and fortified the town. William then sent portions of his troops to raid the area. While all this was happening, Harold Godwinson was feasting to celebrate his bloody victory. But when he had heard the news that William had landed, he and his best men marched down to London in a week, where he kept his housecarls that survived the battle, and waited an additional week for peasant freedmen to arrive and join his army. Harold's army was then roughly the size of William's. He probably should have waited a few more days for his housecarls to rest and for more freedmen to arrive. But Harold's overconfidence after he had won the previous battle with Harold Hardrada led him to set off as soon as his army was ready. Although Harold had been victorious in his last battle, his army was very tired. Not only because he had fought an almighty battle the week before, but his army had just marched 200 miles down to London. This gave them a huge disadvantage because William hadn't fought a previous battle and his army was well rested. Having heard that William had landed and set up camp in Hastings, Harold set up base upon Senlac Hill. Senlac Hill was 10 kilometres northwest of Hastings and was surrounded by marshland. Harold organised his army into a formation called the Shield Wall, which was very effective, and later he was met by the opposing force, William. William had split his army into 3 sections: Bretons on the left side, Normans in the middle, and the French and Flemish on the right-hand side. The front line was made up of archers, the middle line was made up of swordsmen, and the back line was made up of men on horseback. The first move was made by William. The archers fired a sea of arrows towards the shield wall, hoping to penetrate it, but this had little to no effect. The arrows just hit the shields or flew straight over them. Harold was playing it passive, and William was making most of the moves. William then sent his infantry to try and break the wall with some melee battle. This failed to work as they did not have spears and the shield wall was too strong. Freedmen had to take the place of the housecarls because the front line of the shield wall failed to avoid casualties. William saw that the shield wall was very strong and thought his cavalry might have a chance. William ordered his cavalry to charge up the hill to try and pick off some peasant soldiers. William saw this wasn't working. As the cavalry had no spears, it was harder to fight without dying. The cavalry came rushing down the hill. At this point, William fell off his horse and his whole army was in a state of panic. He climbed back up onto his horse and raised his sword and shouted, "I am alive, and by God's grace we will win the day." At this point, morale was high for William's army, so he sent his cavalry to charge up the hill once again. But this time they pulled away at the last minute. William repeated this move 3 times, and on the 3rd time, freedmen came rushing down after them. This left a huge gap in the shield wall. William had done it. He had been successful and broken the shield wall. The feared men that were chasing the cavalry were killed by infantry and archers. Then the arrow of an archer flew across the sky, over the shield wall, and into Harold's eye. Harold's army were completely panicked, and had no choice but to chase William's army. A huge, bloody battle occurred, where 10,000 men, both from each side, had died. But William had come out victorious.